This happened a couple of years ago while I was through hiking in New Zealand. I was on one of those really popular sections of the trail, where you often meet other hikers at shelters along the way. Normally, that's one of the best parts. Swapping stories, sharing tips, and just enjoying the camaraderie of the trail. But not this time. The night before, I'd stopped at a shelter and met this guy. At first, he seemed normal enough, just another hiker passing through. But as the evening went on, he started giving me weird vibes. He kept trying to sit near me, like too close, and made a couple of offhand comments that crossed the line. The one that stuck with me was something like, "Your legs are too nice to be scratched up like that." I mean, I'd just hiked through gorse in shorts. Of course my legs were scratched up. I laughed it off, trying to keep it light, but inside, I was uncomfortable. The worst part was how interested he seemed in my plans. He kept asking about my itinerary, like when I planned to leave the next morning, how far I was going, and where I'd be camping. I stayed vague, something I always do as a solo hiker, but the way he kept pressing made my skin crawl. By the time the shelter quieted down for the night, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't sticking around to see him in the morning. I packed my gear silently before dawn and slipped out like a cat burglar, making sure I didn't wake anyone. It was still dark when I hit the trail, and the early morning quiet felt like a relief. I figured I'd put enough distance between us that I wouldn't have to deal with him again. A few hours later, I was strolling along with my headphones in, feeling good about the day. The trail was peaceful, just the sound of birds and the crunch of my boots on the path. Then I felt it, the vibration of rapid footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it might be another hiker trying to overtake me. No big deal, right? I turned around, and there he was, the same guy from the shelter. He stopped running the second I turned, puffing and red-faced like he'd been chasing me for a while. He waved, and I instinctively waved back, even though my stomach dropped. What the hell is he doing here? I hadn't told anyone where I was going, so he must have guessed or decided to follow me. He stayed behind me for a bit, maybe 20 or 30 meters, then power walked to catch up. The first thing he said when he got close was, "You're quick, aren't you?" with this weird, breathless laugh. I forced myself to smile, trying to stay polite, and made some small talk, just enough to avoid escalating the situation. He said goodbye after a bit, overtaking me quickly, but then slowed down to stay about 50 meters in front of me. That's when it got really creepy. He kept looking back over his shoulder, checking if I was still there. A few times, he even stopped and stood on the trail, forcing me to pass him. Every time I did, he tried to start a conversation again. Then he'd fall in line behind me, walking way too close for comfort. At one point, I could actually hear him breathing. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was racing, and I knew I needed to get rid of him without making a scene. Finally, I turned to him and said, "Hey, I need to pee. Can you go on ahead? I'll catch up." He gave me this odd look, but eventually shrugged and walked off. I watched him disappear around a bend in the trail, waited a minute, then quietly walked further up until I was sure he was out of sight. That's when I made my move. I veered off the trail into the dense forest, trying to keep my footsteps as quiet as possible. The trees were thick, and I crouched low behind a cluster of bushes, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I sat there, gripping my pack straps, and waited. Sure enough, a few minutes later, I saw him walking back down the trail, He was looking around, craning his neck like he was trying to spot me. He walked slowly, stopping every few steps to peer into the forest. My breath caught in my throat. I held perfectly still, not even daring to move a finger. He kept going, further and further back down the trail, until I couldn't see him anymore. The second the coast was clear, I bolted. I didn't even care about making noise. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. I jogged and power walked for hours, skipping the next shelter entirely. There was no way I was signing the logbook either. I didn't want to leave any trace of where I was headed. Along the way, I passed a couple of hikers going the opposite direction. I quickly explained the situation, asking them to let my friends know I was okay if they saw them, but also to keep quiet if the guy asked about me. Thankfully, they agreed. That was one of the longest days I've ever had on a trail. By the time I finally set up camp, I was completely drained, physically and mentally. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound, but thankfully, I didn't see him again. Looking back, I'm grateful I trusted my instincts. Something about him just felt wrong from the start. I don't know what he wanted or what might have happened if I hadn't hidden, but I'm not eager to find out. Now, whenever I'm on a trail, I'm even more careful about keeping my plans vague and trusting my gut. It's better to be overly cautious than to end up in a situation you can't get out of. A few years back, my friend and I were hiking the Eye of the Needle Trail in Jasper, Arkansas. It was one of those perfect winter days where the air is crisp but not freezing, and the forest feels calm and quiet. We'd had a great time exploring, and on the way back, we decided to split up just for fun. The trail has these two parallel routes, not far from each other, and we thought it'd be interesting to see which one was quicker. We could still hear each other if we shouted, so it seemed harmless enough. My route took me above a river, while my friend went a bit lower. It wasn't a steep drop-off, but there was this natural ledge a few feet down, kind of like a shelf below the main plateau. It looked like a shortcut, and I figured I'd jump down to check it out. Big mistake. When I landed, the ground shifted under me in a way that didn't feel right. The walkway wasn't solid ground. It was a thin, woven mess of tree branches and leaves, barely holding together. I froze as I realized I wasn't standing on dirt at all. Just this flimsy layer of debris covering nothing. Beneath it was a straight drop to the river about 15 feet below. There was a big tree trunk sticking out down there, but if I fell, I had no guarantee I'd hit it. And even if I did, that wouldn't be much of a safety net. My first thought was to pull myself back up to the plateau, but the dirt was winter wet and crumbly. Every time I tried to grab hold and climb, the dirt and leaves just slid back down into my face, leaving me with nothing to grip. I tried again and again, panic building with every failed attempt. It felt like the ground above was mocking me, crumbling a little more each time I reached for it. I started yelling for my friend. My voice cracked with how hard I was shouting, but I didn't know if he could hear me over the sound of the river. The longer I stayed stuck, the more my legs started to shake, not just from fear, but from trying to hold perfectly still so I wouldn't break through the branches beneath me. I could hear them creaking and shifting under my weight, and every sound made my heart pound harder. For what felt like an eternity, I just stayed frozen there, clinging to the edge and calling out. I was running out of options fast. The only thing I could think of was letting myself drop and hoping I hit that big trunk without breaking every bone in my body. Or worse, missing it completely and crashing straight into the river below. The thought sent a wave of cold terror through me. Then, finally, I heard my friend shout back. I could barely make out what he was saying, but I didn't care. I wasn't alone anymore. I yelled back, "I'm stuck!" and waited, praying he could find me in time. A few minutes later, I saw him scrambling toward me, his face full of panic as he realized how bad the situation was. He didn't waste any time. He found a sturdy tree a few feet away, tied himself to it with a rope he always carried, and leaned over to grab my hand. "Hold on!" he yelled, as if I was going anywhere else. The moment he grabbed my arm, I felt some of the tension leave my body, but it wasn't over yet. The dirt was so slippery that even he started sliding a little as he pulled. He grunted and cursed, digging his feet into the ground for traction. I tried to help, but every movement made the branches beneath me creak louder, like they were seconds away from giving out. After what felt like forever, he finally managed to pull me up. We both collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air and staring at each other like, what the hell just happened? "Don't ever do that again," he said, half laughing, half scolding. I could barely manage a nod. My legs felt like jelly, and my hands were trembling so badly, I had to sit there for a while just to calm down. If he hadn't been there, I don't know what I would have done. Dropping to the river below was my only other option, and even thinking about it makes my stomach turn. That trunk might have saved me, or it might have just made things worse. Either way, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have walked away unscathed. That day changed the way I think about hiking. I used to feel invincible out there, like nothing bad could happen if I just stayed careful. But now, I realize how easy it is to make a simple decision, a jump, a shortcut, that can put you in real danger. It was a stupid mistake, and I was lucky to have a friend there to pull me out of it. I've never hiked alone since, and every time I look at a trail now, I think twice about taking the fun route. Sometimes the safest option is just staying on the beaten path. A few years ago, I had one of the scariest experiences of my life while hiking in the Utah desert. I'd taken my two kids, just 3 and 5 years old at the time, on what was supposed to be a simple day hike. We'd driven way out into the backcountry, miles down this rough dirt road, to get to a remote trail with a 1,500-foot elevation gain. It was rugged, but beautiful. The kind of place you go to completely escape from the world. The hike started out fine, but as we climbed, it became clear that the trail was just too much for the kids. It was steep, rocky, and exhausting. I didn't want to push them too hard, so I decided we'd turn back. At that point, I was just focused on getting us back to the truck safely and heading home. On the way back down, the trail opened up a bit, and I could see the truck far off in the distance. That's when I noticed something strange. There was someone near it. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, maybe someone taking a break or passing through. But as I got closer, it became clear that something was off. The figure wasn't just resting. They were messing with the truck, peeking into the windows, crouching down and looking at the undercarriage. Then, I watched as they climbed into the bed of the truck and laid down. They didn't get back up. I can't even describe the feeling that hit me. Here I was, in the middle of nowhere with 2 little kids, watching a complete stranger mess with my only way out. My first thought was that it was an ambush. I mean, why else would someone do this in such a remote place? I felt my stomach twist, and my heart started pounding. When we were about half a mile away, I shouted at the top of my lungs, "Get away from my truck! Get out of here!" My voice echoed off the rocks, but the guy didn't move at first. He just peeked over the edge of the truck bed and stared at us. It was the kind of look that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Calm, almost calculating. When he didn't move, I pulled out the gun I always carry on hikes in remote areas. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping it would scare him off. That's when he hopped out of the bed, raised his arms, and made this weird sweeping motion toward all 4 tires. Then, he just started walking away, like nothing had happened. I thought that was the end of it, but when we finally reached the truck, my worst fears were confirmed. All 4 tires had been slashed, and the fuel tank in the bed of the truck had been stabbed open. Gas was leaking everywhere, and we were completely stranded. I looked around and saw the guy off in the distance, walking away. But then he stopped. He turned around and started walking back toward us. I didn't wait to see what his plan was. I pulled out my phone, praying for service, and by some miracle, I had a signal. I called 911, trying to stay calm while I kept an eye on the guy. He was getting closer, moving slowly, but deliberately. Thankfully, the dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, and within 10 minutes, though it felt like hours, I saw the flashing lights of police cars coming down the dirt road. The guy must have seen them too, because he turned and bolted, running toward the vast expanse of the Book Cliffs. The police immediately gave chase, even calling in a plane to help search the area. But he vanished into the wilderness like a ghost. The officers stayed with us while we figured out how to get out of there. We had to call for a tow truck, which took hours to arrive. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd come to being trapped out there with that guy. I kept replaying everything in my head. His slashing the tires, stabbing the fuel tank, and just calmly walking back toward us. What if I hadn't had a phone signal? What if help hadn't arrived in time? For 2 years, I didn't know who he was or why he'd done it. All I knew was that he was still out there, somewhere. It wasn't until much later that I learned he'd been caught. His name was Jason Pogue, and he'd been living in an abandoned ghost town nearby, committing similar crimes. He was arrested after pulling the same stunt on someone else. When I looked him up, I found out he's still getting into trouble to this day. That day changed the way I think about hiking in remote areas. I still love the solitude, but I'm a lot more cautious now. I double-check everything, stay closer to more trafficked trails, and I never, ever leave home without making sure my phone has full charge and my gun is loaded. Last year, I decided to squeeze in one last camping trip before winter set in. It was late fall, and I knew my gear wasn't quite up to the task of freezing temperatures and snow, so I figured this would be my last hurrah for the season. I planned a solo trip into a valley I'd been wanting to explore for a while. It was remote enough that I didn't expect to see anyone else out there, especially this late in the season. I had it all mapped out. My campsite was nestled in the valley, and about 3 kilometers away, there were a couple of alpine lakes I wanted to check out. They looked amazing on the map, and I'd planned to bushwhack and scramble up to them after setting up camp. But of course, I got a little too ambitious. On my way in, I couldn't resist taking a few side trips to explore. By the time I finally rolled into the campsite, It was late, later than I'd planned. The sun was already sinking behind the mountains, and I could feel the cold creeping in. The valley had occasional grizzly warnings posted, so I set up camp as quickly as I could and decided to head straight for the lakes before it got too dark. The first part of the hike wasn't too bad. There was a rough path to follow for a while, but eventually, the trail disappeared, and I was bushwhacking through the trees. It was just me and the wilderness, and I knew how isolated I was. Every few steps, I called out, "Hey ho!" the classic bear alert call, to make sure nothing was lurking nearby. I'd done it 100 times before, and it always felt more like a precaution than anything else, until I heard it back. "Hey ho!" It was loud, clear, and definitely a woman's voice. My heart stopped for a second. It sounded close, like she was right behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just trees. No movement, no sound. I stood there for a minute, listening. Maybe it was an echo, or someone hiking behind me, but the woods were dead silent. I waited, expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, but no one did. Feeling uneasy, I kept going. The climb up to the lakes was steep, and by the time I got to the top, it was starting to get darker. I looked back down into the forest, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Still nothing. The lakes were beautiful, serene, reflecting the last bits of light from the sky, but I couldn't enjoy them. I was too unsettled. Who had called back to me? Why hadn't I seen anyone? And why would someone be wandering out here, this late in the season, with the sun nearly gone? I didn't stay long. The creeping darkness and the weirdness of the situation pushed me to leave. I practically ran back down the trail, not even caring about the scratches from branches or the cold biting at my face. By the time I got back to my campsite, it was almost fully dark, and my heart didn't stop racing until I saw that a couple of other campers had shown up while I was gone. I asked them if they'd seen anyone on the trail. Maybe it had been one of them, but they shook their heads. "We haven't seen anyone," one of them said. "We came from the ridge." Here's the thing. To get to that part of the valley, you'd either have to pass through the campsite or cross over some serious mountain passes. There wasn't an easy way in, and if someone had been out there, they'd have to hike back through complete darkness. It just didn't make sense. That night, as I sat by the campfire with the other campers, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The voice had been so clear, so close. It wasn't my imagination, and it wasn't an echo. Someone had found me out in the middle of the woods, miles from any trailhead, and if they were hiking out that night, they'd done so without light, through dense forest. I don't know who it was, or why they were there, but I haven't stopped wondering. Every time I go out solo now, I think about that voice, and how easily someone found me out in the middle of nowhere. It's enough to make you think twice about how alone you really are in the wilderness.